Thousands dead, hundreds of thousands wounded, and millions who still truly don't understand what this devastating war was for. The greatest military defeat of the USSR in the entire history of the regime, the war in Afghanistan. Why did the Soviets go into a foreign country and try to impose their interests and religion? What do that war and the new one started by Putin have in common? Why was a giant state unable to defeat a relatively small mountain people? And how does Moscow risk, 45 years later, ending up at the same broken trough of a failed blitzkrieg? We'll tell you all about this right now in the new episode of Arsenal. For the Soviet Union, the protracted and arduous Afghan war became the largest and most significant armed conflict they had engaged in since the devastating end of the Second World War. This extensive and challenging conflict ultimately spanned a considerable period, lasting precisely 9 years, 1 month, and 18 days. However, even now, many people still can't answer what Soviet citizens were dying for there. As it turned out decades later, the loud slogan for which thousands died, international duty, simply boiled down to the USSR's banal desire not to lose the prestige race to the United States. And when their influence in the region began to wane, the Soviets decided to restore it by force. So, in 1978, as a result of the April Revolution, power in Afghanistan ended up in the hands of the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, PDPA, the Afghan communists, who operated under the patronage of the Soviet Union. The government removed Islamic elements from the country's coat of arms, added a red star, and declared that from now on the country would move toward a bright socialist future along the path of Marxism-Leninism. The conservative population reacted to these changes quite radically, with things escalating to executions and the army suppressing uprisings. The USSR, in turn, supported the Afghan government as its ally. The Kremlin feared that the fall of the current regime would lead to the loss of Soviet influence and the strengthening of American influence in the region. And that's almost what happened. Through a coup in Afghanistan, a new government came to power, hoping to receive support from the United States. The USSR decided not to delay any longer.
In the logic of the Cold War, the defeat of the socialist project in Afghanistan meant a local, but still a defeat for the USSR in its struggle with the USA and the approach of imperialist aggressors right up to the border of the Soviet, state, Soviet Central Asia. That's why the Politburo decided to take control of the situation in Afghanistan into its own hands. They decided to eliminate Amin. Without any elections, Babrak Karmal was appointed the new president of Afghanistan, and he was completely controlled by Moscow. The Soviet 40th Army and several separate airborne divisions were immediately deployed to Afghanistan. In total, more than 100,000 soldiers and 1,800 tanks.
Just like in Ukraine 45 years later, back then in Moscow, everything was planned as a blitzkrieg lasting just a couple of days. The scenario is painfully familiar to everyone today: special forces paratroopers, highly professional military, elimination of the political leadership, and a forced drift back towards the Kremlin.
At 7 p.m. on that same December 27th, Soviet troops attacked the palace. Among them were also KGB special unit fighters from Alpha and Zenit. They were dressed in Afghan uniforms and rode in military vehicles with Afghan identification marks. In other words, Soviet military troops came to a foreign country and decided to kill the main political leader, who had come to power through a resolution that the USSR itself had meticulously organized. And the most important and terrible thing about this is that almost any Russian would consider this normal.
After all, today, essentially, the same thing is happening. The only difference is that neither the takeover nor the change of Ukrainian government succeeded. But let's get back to Afghanistan. There, they did manage to replace the leadership, and the country was headed by the pro-Soviet Babrak Karmal. After that, the conflict escalated into a full-scale war between Soviet troops and the Mujahideen, who were supported by the US, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and China, which, except for the list of allies, is very reminiscent of today's events.
When comparing the invasion of Afghanistan and Ukraine, it's impossible not to notice that the Kremlin's logic of action is very similar. In both cases, it's about a strategically important, far-off territory that the main enemies, of course the Americans, are encroaching upon in order to move right up to our borders. And in both cases, a swift military operation is planned, with the goal of replacing the head of state. In the case of Ukraine, it was apparently assumed that Volodymyr Zelensky would flee and his place would be taken, for example, by the Ukrainian politician and Putin's close associate Viktor Medvedchuk. And although in the first case the coup succeeded and in the second it did not, in both cases the Kremlin made a strategic miscalculation. What was expected to be an easy military walk turned out, in reality, to be a protracted war that undermined the internal foundations of the state.
At first, the local residents, weary of civil war, greeted the Soviet troops with joy. In some places, they were welcomed with flowers and flags, but this attitude did not last long at all.
The Soviet soldiers very quickly showed their true colors. They robbed the local people, raped Afghan women, and killed not just individual families, but wiped out entire villages, or as they are called in Afghanistan, kishlaks. This became such a widespread phenomenon that it quickly met with strong resistance from the Afghan people. The most terrible thing was that the Soviet soldiers genuinely did not understand that they were criminals. And here it's really not a matter of military invasion, for which the government is to blame, but rather a matter of, the behavior of the soldiers. The thing is, they considered themselves gods and really acted with complete lawlessness.
Remembering the horrific events in Bucha, Izium, Mariupol, and dozens of other innocent towns across Ukraine where Russian soldiers have brutally set foot, you truly come to realize that today's occupiers are acting very much in the grim traditions of their fathers who fought 45 years ago. And, by the way, they are also failing in their hopes to quickly crush the smaller enemy forces with sheer numbers, and are just as silent about it out of embarrassment. It was exactly the same in Afghanistan.
Soviet troops rather quickly fell into the trap of a mountainous guerrilla war, where they managed to control the towns and urban centers, but outside of them, effective power was firmly in the hands of the insurgents. Officially, this war was called International Assistance to the Brotherly Afghan People. The state media usually said nothing about the ongoing fighting, only about the construction of new factories and the reforms being carried out with the help of the Soviet Union by the brave local communists, who were led by Comrade Karmel.
Almost immediately, the international community condemned the introduction of Soviet troops into Afghanistan, and almost immediately, the Soviets responded that it was their own business. Year after year, as new conscripts were drafted, young men were shipped off in droves to storm one village or another, and then brought back home in droves in zinc coffins. By the way, the term Cargo 200 originated during this very war. And, just like today, this topic was off limits.
Those who died in Afghanistan were buried, if not completely in secret, then at least without any state honors. And generally speaking, this approach worked. The topic of the war did not dominate Soviet society, and except for a few dissidents, no one protested. The issue only concerned those who might be drafted into the army and their families. And even when, in 1982, the draft deferment for university students was canceled, and at its peak in 1987, almost all students of draft age were conscripted into the army, society, for the most part, continued its calm, stagnant existence. Only a few university rectors spoke out against this, but of course, to no avail. Perhaps this is exactly the reason for the ongoing ban on the word war.
You have to admit, there are just too many similarities with Russia's current war against Ukraine. However, there are differences as well. In the USSR, there were still people who could openly voice the problem, unlike today's Putin-era generals. For example, in the 7th year of the war, they finally admitted that it's much easier to change the government than to change the mindset of freedom-loving people.
So, in 1986, at a Politburo meeting, the head of the Soviet General Staff, Sergei Akrameyev, stated the following: "We control Kabul and the provincial centers, but we simply cannot establish authority in the captured territory. We've lost the struggle for the Afghan people. The government is supported by only a minority of the population."
In the end, under years of pressure from both outside and within, the USSR, going through perestroika, was forced to pursue a peaceful resolution to the conflict.
Will this war ever truly end while the mothers and wives of the fallen are still alive, their children left orphans, and they still haven't received a clear and honest answer to the question, for what purpose?
They left with their heads held high, even though the whole world saw them as occupiers and criminals. By February 1989, there were no Soviet troops left in Afghanistan. No one ever explained to the young men what they were fighting for.
On average, about 1,500 Soviet soldiers died in Afghanistan. Even more were wounded, and that was impossible to hide. But here, I think there's really nothing much left to say. The Afghan trauma is still felt in Russian culture to this day.
Interestingly, they weren't welcomed as heroes back home either. Soviet society didn't really understand what interests they could possibly have in Central Asia. And the authorities weren't exactly eager to share details about a shamefully lost war, in which around 15,000 Soviet citizens died for nothing, and hundreds of thousands more were left disabled.
According to the list of information prohibited from publication in the open press, which was issued several years before the invasion of Afghanistan, it was forbidden to write about the participation of Soviet soldiers in any combat operations after 1945. It was only with the start of perestroika, when party circles finally began to raise the issue of the need to withdraw from Afghanistan, that a new directive appeared, and now the media were allowed to talk about the heroic deeds of Soviet soldiers, though, of course, without specifying the circumstances under which they were performed.
The same inglorious fate awaits today's veterans of the so-called special military operation. All the more so because this war is even more treacherous and brutal. Did you like this video? Then be sure to give it a like and subscribe to our Arsenal channel.